I would like to introduce, for you who don't know, and I think everybody does, Miss Jennifer Ahern, who is the Chief Officer in the Ministry of Health, under which the Department of Counseling Services now falls. She's here to give some opening remarks on behalf of the Minister.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for inviting me here this morning on behalf of the Minister. So on behalf of Minister Dwayne Seymour, who is now the Minister of Health, Environment, Culture and Housing, I'm still trying to get used to the new titles, I do bring apologies. He has cabinet this morning. He had hoped that he could be here to greet you himself, but he's asked me to come in his stead. And I just want, on his behalf, to extend our thanks and our congratulations to Youth Act and the Department of Counseling Services, and to all of you for taking part in this innovative program. I want to welcome our overseas visitors. We hope you enjoy your stay. And I'm sure that over the next few weeks, everyone involved in this training is going to find some really beneficial things to take away. I mean, all of us have been looking at the headlines over the last few weeks. It seems a bit like the world has gone mad in terms of the crime that we have been seeing. And while the RCIPS have been doing a fantastic job with tracking them down, the prison now is at its full capacity. We've seen those headlines as well. And I'm sure that you'll all join me with wondering, what can we do? Clearly, we can't continue with the things that we have been doing. We need to find some new ways to look at crime prevention and some intervention. And I think one of the beauties of this SNAP program is that it's focusing on early and effective evidence-based intervention for children. Studies have shown time and time again that antisocial behavior at a young age often leads to criminal behavior at older ages. And I think that if we can find tools that we can implement that will help us intervene as early as possible to help change the direction and break that cycle, that we'll see not only short-term benefits within the school system in terms of behavior change and positive behavior changes with the children remaining in the system, but longer-term benefits in terms of prevention down the road. So I really do commend Youth Act and the Department of Counseling Services for moving forward with this program. And I want to thank you again for taking the time to get involved and to help move it forward. I'm looking forward to hearing about the successes that we'll see with the pilot program in the summer that Department of Counseling Services is launching. And I'm sure that as we see those successes, we'll identify more opportunities to roll this out across the system. So again, on behalf of Minister Seymour, thank you very much for your time, and I wish you guys all the best with the training.
Anyway, I just want to echo everybody's sentiments. Welcome, thank you for being here. I think from my perspective, I want to say thank you to Bonnie for having Youth Act welcome us on board. When they brought the representatives from SNAP down several years ago, there was lots about the program that really appealed to me in terms of why we wanted to become involved. I think one of those things was looking at the assessment tool that they use, and I remember speaking to Desiree about that at that presentation, because it's really going to help us focus our efforts. I think sometimes we all get overwhelmed and try to be all things to all people, and I think what SNAP really helps us hone in on by using their assessment tool is identifying the right target population for their program. They also have a great system of evaluation and monitoring, which I think is something that is also very lacking in terms of some of the other programs that we have brought on board before. It also fits very nicely with the way our department works. We already work with families and parents and children together, and we do counseling with parents and very strength-based orientation, and so that's lots of things that our staff are already starting to do. So there was lots about SNAP that was really appealing for us to come on board with Youth Act, and I just want to thank Bonnie and the Youth Act team for allowing us to partner with them. I think the other piece for me is also recognizing that it's a shift in the way we're going to be working, and that makes the presence of all of our partner agencies here extremely important, because I think sometimes when we are getting referrals now, the horse is long out of the gate in terms of some of those children. As our CO Ahern already mentioned, this is an early intervention program. We are going to identify children at an earlier age, identify families, because I think sometimes we we slam our parents because they're not working in the way we think they should, without recognizing that they too have passed through certain milestones, and their tolerance and frustration level has built, and they are somewhat hopeless. I think intervening with families earlier will also be more rewarding, I think, for us, and we should see better results that way. So I'm very excited. I'm looking forward to the next 9 days. I know for my staff, they're all kind of looking at me with daggers when I mention the fact that we're going to be here for 9 days. It is a significant commitment, and I appreciate all of you for taking the time, being committed to doing this, and wanting to learn about this model. I really am looking forward to it, and I'm excited by the possibilities of what it can offer. So thank you.
Bonnie was just talking a little bit earlier about the fact that CDI isn't just SNAP. So we have 4 like big areas that we tend to focus on. Early intervention is where the SNAP falls into. We also have YJ. So Bonnie was talking about in the prison. So we have a youth justice facilities in Ontario that are currently receiving the youth justice program of SNAP. So that's a really interesting program because it's almost it's a similar thing. It's done a little bit differently, but it's done over like iPads and iPods. So they're able to kind of answer questions without having to like let other people know what they're actually answering. So we can talk about self-control and problem-solving skills without having to worry about the fact that they're in a larger group and worrying about kind of the impressions that some of the other people are going to have of them. So that's pretty cool. We also do a lot of work in family violence. So we go into some of the shelters. We have a pretty cool program called Taste of Home. And Taste of Home, Toronto being one of the most multicultural cities in the world, Taste of Home provides kids who are living in shelters the ability to kind of introduce their culture to other people within that shelter. So they're able to kind of have somebody come in, cook a meal, that's one of their traditional meals, and share that with the rest of the people in the shelter as well. So to kind of bring home to them, because a lot of times they're in a pretty tight situation where they are. We do a lot of counseling programs around that. So we do CASAT, which is the Central Agency Sexual Abuse Treatment program as well. We have Integra, which just recently joined CDI. So Integra is a program that takes a look at the intersection of mental health and learning disabilities and how those two interplay on each other. Really cool programs that are involved with that. So there's one evidence-based program called Mindfulness Martial Arts, where they're actually able to use martial arts to deliver some of the mindfulness skills that the kids are going to need to learn, especially given the struggles they're going to have in the classrooms and things like that. A lot of advocacy there as well. How do you deliver educational programming to kids that might be struggling with learning disabilities, and how does that impact the way that they learn? We actually it was kind of like a presentation that we had delivered to us from Integra, and it just talked about what it was like to have a learning disability. And so they were able to kind of teach people who didn't have a learning disability what it actually felt like. So, activities where information would be left out, perspective activities where you would take a look at it from one perspective but have to experience what it's like to be in a situation where everybody else kind of sees it one way and you're the only person who's like, well, I don't see it that way at all, right? I don't understand this where everybody else is doing well. So interesting programming there. And we also have healthy child development as well. So amongst the biggest work that we do, it's in our early years centers in Ontario, predominantly in Toronto. So we have 5 early years centers. And then we actually have 2, so Parkdale High Park and a couple other learning centers that we do operate it out of there. So we have a whole list of services that we do provide. So it's not just SNAP, but SNAP is a large portion of what we do as well. Yeah. So just so you guys are aware, there is no slide deck handout for this one. Some of it contains a lot of research, and some of that stuff we've been allowed to talk about, but not necessarily allowed to disseminate. So just so you guys are aware, you won't have that. If you guys do want fact sheets based on this stuff, we can get it out to you once we get back to Toronto. So make sure to write your email address down on the thing. And if you guys do want that, I'll just send it out to everybody who was here. So you're going to hear maybe a little bit about our department being kind of referred to as the CCCO, so the Center for Children Committing Offenses. It's kind of not a retired term, but it's not something that we use a lot anymore. We are now the implementation team, so we have 2 arms of the implementation team. So we do research and we do the training, so I'm the trainer. Our researchers are back at home, they're not able to travel, so they got the short end of the stick, we'll say. And they don't get to do all that fun stuff. They get to do all the cool stuff around like taking a look at outcomes and what that actually means and being able to kind of guide the treatment stuff that we do. So they get that ability. So they get to see the bigger picture really. What are we actually doing in the real world? Then they get to share it with us. So really what it looks like now is essentially this. So as a team, we're disseminating the information. On one side, it's us as the trainers consultants who work continuously with sites. And on the other side is the research. So they're digesting the information that they are getting and then releasing that to the public through us as well. Over guiding principles, and I think it was Judy, you talked a little bit about the fact that we knock a lot of the parents, and really that's some of the stuff that we take a look at in our guiding principles are kind of contravening that, right? So we take a look at the kids and we realize that those kids who are committing offenses need help. So there's something that's blocking them from making the right decisions. And so that's ideally, that's what we want to be able to do, is be able to intervene with that. We realize that these kids can be identified. So these aren't kids that are just like, oh, wow, you know, that just happened and, you know, nobody had an idea. We're going to talk a little bit about that in a second. We realize that the severity of the antisocial behavior can be measured because not everybody is exactly the same. Not every child who decides to break the rules or break the law is exactly the same. We realize that we need to be able to prioritize specific people so that we can, you know, dose out proper interventions to people. And so that's all part of it. One of the biggest things is that we realize that intervention can change that negative prognosis into a positive one. So we do have power over doing this. We can empower people to change the behavior that they have become accustomed to change that. We can also be able to identify the things that they're already using that are adaptive and be able to say, okay, you know, these are the things that you're using. Here's how we reapply them. Right? So there's a lot of things that you're able to draw upon the strengths that they already have. And I think the biggest ones is that the children and families deserve our help and support. When we look at the families in particular, the families are, you know, a lot of the times the kids are learning from the parents, but the parents have learned this, it could be hundreds of years ago, these behaviors that they have learned, right? So it's something that they've been exposed to and they're kind of regurgitating this over and over again. And our goal is obviously to prevent offending and reoffending in kids under the age of 12. So the ideal situation is that they're able to get through the program and they're able to take what they need to know about this program and about self-control and problem-solving skills, and then not get in trouble after the age of 12. And the reason why in the age of 12, anybody, here's a random number for people, but why the age of 12 do you think? That's right. Age of criminal responsibility in Canada is age of 12. So we want to be able to get them before the age of 12. What's the age here? Yeah.
He said 11.
11? Yeah. There we go. So 11. It's like, that guy. Yeah, he knows. He knows. Yeah. Oh, there we go. So same kind of thing. So we want to be able to get them these skills before the age of 12. Because we want them to be able to have these things before they start making decisions where they can be held liable. A lot of our funding is created in those ways as well. This is the fact that we can't ignore. So the Lober, Farrington, and Pettichuk study in 2003, we realized that there's actually a lot of warning that we get for the kids that are being identified. There's a lot of warning. They don't just, like, any Star Trek fans here? Awesome, a couple. I'm a little bit of a Trekkie, but so like Scotty beam me up kind of thing, that's not the way these kids play out. These kids don't just appear out of nowhere. They have a track record, they have a history behind them. And so when we look at the average age of 14 and a half when they end up in court, you have this backstory. There's a whole bunch of opportunities where we could have been able to identify these people, these kids, and starting out really young too, and really minor behaviors. When we look at age 7, minor behaviors begin, and then moderate serious behavior problems starting age 9 and a half, and committing serious delinquency offenses just before the age of 12. So we're taking a look at that, you know, that behavior being fully ingrained, the thinking being fully ingrained, this being a CBT program. You hear a lot of the CBT stuff repeated over and over again, but a lot of this is really dangerous because you see right before the age of 12, you see those behaviors kind of coalescing into this one event that is not very good. So they're already being identified. People are already waiting for that point in time when they're 12, and something can be done. And then at age 14 and a half, we realize those violent offenses are occurring. So that's an average age, really. So we did have a lot of warning. They didn't just appear out of nowhere. And that's really the big thing about the fact that we can't ignore. when we talk about, and I don't know if it's the same thing in the Cayman Islands, but in Ontario we see this really, it's really evident. It is changing. But why do you think we refer to the kids who are aged 6 to 12? Why do you think we refer to them as the forgotten group?
Yeah. Hit our radar in a big way.
Exactly it. So why do you think under the age of 6? Why do you think that has so much attention? They're still developing, so things are very obvious. Parents are still kind of like in the mix. And then over 12, what do we tend to focus on? So the behaviors are a lot worse. Maybe we focus more money is given into life skills and those kind of things that we need to be able to teach people. But in between, we notice this big gap in Ontario where the funding isn't necessarily there. So we're looking at those kids because they're not at home, they're at school, they're now in a new environment, they're like kids will be kids, but when it comes to the age of 12 and they're still fighting, they're still vandalizing, they're still lighting fires, those kinds of things, we're having this big issue. Right? So they tend to be the forgotten group, and that is changing. The ministry is really changing its mind around that. And so in Ontario, what we're seeing is we're seeing a lot more like direct funding. We just got 7 direct funded sites all the way across Ontario. There's a few direct funded sites that are right from the Ministry of Child and Youth Services in Ontario as well. So that's a really nice shift. So we're being able to recognize those middle years as effective years for actual intervention. We know that they've been ignored. We realize that the number is relatively small and it's not as immediate. They present with a unique challenge. So they're a unique challenge. We need to be able to deliver them self-control skills, but in a way that they can actually like use them. So we can't just have these big abstract conversations with kids because they're not going to get it. And we have to be able to go to them and say, these things are going to be struggle. They're not going to be, it's not going to be easy. When somebody's pressuring you to fight, it's not going to be easy to walk away from them because everybody else is going to be calling you a chicken. So how do you deal with this? Right? How do you deal with all this? We want to be able to intervene, obviously, before the minor offenses become serious and before the occasional offender becomes chronic. Right? So that's really the key there. When we're looking at some of the facts, I'm not going to go through all of these in depth, but one of the things that you're going to see in terms of conduct disorder and oppositional defiance disorder, once we realize that oppositional problems and conduct problems are actually one of the biggest costs to the mental health systems in Ontario. It's huge, and I'm sure it's exactly the same here. Those conduct-related issues are a serious problem. One of the biggest reasons for referral to, actually the number one reason for referral to children's mental health centers in North America is around conduct and behavior and things like that. So really interesting. Down there, we see 50 to 70% of incarcerated men in Ontario have a history of conduct problems. So conduct disorder there. Really big indicators there. Right? So if we take a look at the amount of social spending that goes into that, and I don't want to look at it from even just a social spending perspective, even these lives, the capacity for changing this is really big if we can teach people new skills. In Canada, we see that the cost, actually, when I was talking about the place that I used to work in Hamilton, we had 2 secure custody facilities. So essentially they are like Supermax for kids. They would house about 30 to 35 kids each. And this was at Banyan in Hamilton. So we had 2 of those facilities that were operating. And just so that, I don't know if you guys have a history or you know where the lay of the land in Ontario, but Hamilton is really a high needs community. It's got a lot of research has been done on the quality of life in Hamilton, especially in the east end of Hamilton, where some of these facilities are, and how people tend to live approximately about 21 years less than people who live on the west side of Hamilton. So there's a lot that's involved there, right? And it is a really unique community. And if you are interested in any of that information, it is called the Code Red Project. Code Red out of McMaster University took a look at this, and a lot of it is even just scarcity of food. So when we had our offices, in the East End, they would have like a lot of 7-Eleven. You can go and get a taquito, but you can't go and get an apple. Right? So a lot of that scarcity of food, scarcity of resources, a lot of areas where there's like 33, 34 languages spoken in one community, can't really speak to your neighbors because there's no integration activities that were being done. There's no real like community type activities that were being done. So that's really like a huge thing, right? But going back to my point, the $100,000 a year, that's really, I mean, it's a 1997 stat. It was about $120,000 a year when we were looking at the kids that we were housing in Banyan's programs, Errol and PYC. So a lot of money when you're taking a look at that. Even within the forgotten group, we have this overshadowed group. This group of girls that we tend to look at as, not as aggressive as, sugar and spice and everything nice. But what we realize is even when we look at this quote here, it's Tremblay 1901, it's Lober's paradox. But even the spirit of that, when you read it out, it's really the reason why we're intervening with girls is because they're then going to be the future people who raise boys. And this is 1991, right? This is like not very long ago, right? So we realize that there is this kind of like go around. But I think the more accurate thing that we started to notice in some of the research is that childhood aggression predicts the same problems in girls as it does in boys. Same problems. And so when we take a look at the Earl later on, this is actually the last day, when we take a look at the Earl, you're gonna see what ends up happening with the high-risk girls is they're just as high risk as the boys. They're involved in the same violent stuff. They're involved in it just maybe at a little bit of a later age, but they're still there, right? They're still present. So to ignore all that and not give the interventions is really, it's myopic, right? To think, these kids they're not going to turn into somebody who's really aggressive, and their lives matter too. This is further proof. So this is based on some research that we do conduct at Intake. Really interesting stuff here. So the red bars are the girls, and the blue bars are the boys. So this is a BCFPI, so the Brief Child and Family Phone Interview. So you guys are aware, the Brief Child and Family Phone Interview is everything but brief. It's about an hour and a half that you're on the phone with the parents. So I hate that name. It's just the Child and Phone Family Interview for me. It's not a good name for it. So over here, there's two particular areas we're going to pay attention to. There's the CDP. I don't know if you guys can see it in the back, but it's a third set of bars in CDP, and then CFS on the fourth from the far right. These are areas where we're noticing that at intake, those red bars are actually higher. So around the 70s range, that's where we start to see clinical scores. These are the top 2% of the population. Sorry, am I blocking you? No? Top 2% of the population. So in terms of aggressive behaviors, those kinds of things, they're showing up there. What are you noticing about the girls? They're higher. They're higher. That first one is conduct problems. Second one is family disruptions. Why do you think that might be? Why might that be? These girls are showing up so high in comparison to the boys, even though we seem to think sugar and spice, everything nice. Sorry? So the boys it tends to be the reverse. So the boys tend to be a little bit, the parents are like, fighting, those kinds of things. Boys will be boys. We need a little help for him so he doesn't get in trouble later on. But with the girls, there's two things that are interacting here. The behavior tends to be exhibited mostly at home. Not saying that it doesn't happen at school, but mostly at home. And they're getting to the point where they can't handle it anymore. So they're waiting to the point where the behavior is that severe to report that. And so while we're taking a look at the interaction of like what we expect from boys and what we expect from girls too. So that girl that's hitting and pulling hair and maybe punching her brother out, that would be something that we would be like, whoa, that's his sister too, right? Like that kind of thing that's happening. But with boys, it tends to be more of an expected behavior. And we're going to look at that in just a minute in terms of the expectations around gender and why we see that here. So yeah, a lot of the times what happens is the parents, they're reluctant to call because they go and do the parent-teacher interviews and the teacher's like, oh, your daughter's awesome. So what do they think? Yeah, awful parent, right? I'm an awful parent. So here's the hard thoughts that prevent them from actually reaching out. So these are the things that actually prevent them from doing that. There's a whole bunch of reasons why this could be happening. But what we are noticing is that when they are getting referred, they are at a higher level. So when we look at gender stereotypes, so we talked a little bit about what actually like forms gender stereotypes and what we expect from girls versus boys in terms of behavior. But for girls who, and here's an experiment here, for girls who stick up for what they want, girls who are pretty staunch, they can tell people, nope, this is not what I want you to do. I want to do this. What do they get labeled as? Bossy. A harsher term out there. Strong-willed, right? That's like disguising it as like, yeah, strong-willed, right? Determined. There's, you know, I heard bossy getting thrown around, but there is another B word that gets thrown around at kids. Yeah, exactly. But if a boy does it, he's a leader. He's a go-getter. He's assertive. So there's a whole bunch of different things that are interacting here that prevent that actual like expression of assertiveness skills from girls. On the flip side, you know, a boy that cries, that expresses their feelings, that maybe tells people that they don't like that their feelings were hurt. What do we call those boys? Sissies. Sorry, there's another one? Punk. Yeah. All these different words that, and you know what? It's interesting because we can describe two different people with two different terms when it's exactly the same phenomenon. Right? So it's on both flip sides. We talked a little bit about the age and the location of the behavior. Boys tend to exhibit their behavior across the board. They're at school maybe getting in fights. They're at hockey getting in fights. They're doing whatever. Here I'm saying hockey. Right? Yeah. Exactly. Football. Actually, believe it or not, that is my love. Football, soccer is my love. That's World Cup. Forget it. I'm out of commission for that whole time. In terms of the label that we give them, it's very different, kind of like what we were talking about, right? So we give them a very different label based on their gender. There's a huge impact. The legal context in Canada, I'm not going to go through this with too much depth, but in 1994, the Young Offenders Act raised the age of criminal liability in Canada to 12 years of age. It previously was 10. So you had now this gap of 2 years where police were like, I don't know what to do other than bring you back home or call child welfare. I don't know what to do with you. Right? So there was this really like big gap. They tended to fall into that purview of child welfare, so you get a lot more calls going to child welfare. What does that mean to the parent? Me as a parent gets a lot more flack from child welfare, right? So then they then turn around and say, oh, I don't really want to have anything to do with any sort of help from outside, because that tends to be the motivation is to call child welfare. Because they notice that at those age, if it was a concern, and that a lot of things tend to fall under that umbrella of concern, they would call child welfare, or they would bring them home and be like, here's your son or here's your daughter. They were doing this. Hopefully they don't do it again next time. Talk to them, and all is well. But then 2 weeks later, the same kind of thing. Right? So we're 30 plus years in the making. So we celebrated our 30th anniversary in 2015. So we're now moving towards the 32nd anniversary of SNAP. So it started in 1985. We're able to take a look at, we have these kids that have disruptive behavior problems. So what do we do? How do we actually support them? Right? So what can we do for them? And how do we do it in a way that's not wasting resources? Because that's number one. We waste resources, we waste money, and then the government turns around and says, I'm not giving you the money to do this because it's not cost effective. So how do we do it in a cost effective way that actually changes lives? So just a little bit of background. It actually started in a residential program in the 1970s where we kind of started to, Lena Jamari, who you saw in the video there, was talking about the fact that if we could reach a lot of children around the world, that would be amazing. If not everyone around the world, that would be amazing. Established in the 1970s. The purview of the program is really 6 to 11, and that really takes a look at brain development as well. When can they start to handle large amounts of information on self-control, problem-solving skills, be able to handle some of the mindfulness that goes along with it, being able to identify what's happening in their body when they're feeling certain emotions, all those types of things. It is for impulse control and behavior problems, disruptive behavior problems. It's theoretical based, it's cognitive behavioral therapy essentially delivered in an easy way for parents and kids to be able to understand. And it was the basis of the Under 12 Outreach Program and Girls Connection. So it is gender specific, and that's one thing that we'll kind of cover a little bit. So the interventions are gender specific. There are different groups for boys than there are girls, and we don't put them in together. And it really talks about the number of girls that tend to get referred, because we don't want to put like one girl in a group with 7, with 6 other boys in a group of 7, right? We don't want to have that situation because we tend to see that their behavior changes in the group. When we look at the cost of delivering SNAP to a child, and when we're looking at it in the long term, in Ontario, it costs about $1,370 for just SNAP group itself. But in the long term, if they require extra services, it costs about $6,700. So far cry from the $120,000 it takes per year. And really, we're looking at about 9 months on average that these kids need an intervention for, right? That's what we see. It is widely disseminated, so it's across Canada, but it has reaches in the United States, in the Netherlands, in Scotland, in a number of communities. We were at one point in time in Australia, and they're looking to bring us back again because they kind of ran out of funding. So they had to discontinue the program, but they really wanted it. So we're going back to Australia as well. And so how do we do it? We do it through formal training. And we have kind of a dissemination kit right there, which, you know what, was really nice because Customs really didn't bug me about this plastic wrapped big box of things. So there are some implications of saying that you're evidence-based, right? So when you throw that term around, evidence-based really means that you have to be able to learn from yourself, you have to be able to scrutinize yourself, and we've been able to do that reasonably well over the course of the life of SNAP. And what we've been able to do, I'm just going to forward it over there. I'm not going to take too much time here, but in 1985, you saw that the SNAP Boys program was developed. Girls were involved with that. So girls were put in that group, and we saw differing outcomes. It was still effective, but not as effective for the girls. It wasn't as effective as it could be. We saw in 1996 the development of the SNAP Girls model. So that's really where we started to see the difference. You could focus more on the relational work that needed to be done with some of the girls. We could dig further into some of the skills because we did notice that some of the girls were functioning at a little bit of a, not saying anything guys, but they were functioning at a little bit of a higher level than the guys were at that age. So when you were, like age, the girls tended to be able to talk circles around the guys in terms of like skills and stuff like that. So we really need to be able to differentiate the actual intervention. We changed the program a little bit, and we started to make it kind of more closer together in 2006 to 2008. So some of the things that you're going to see in the new manuals that you're taking a look at is it's a little bit closer together. There's very different ways of delivering certain skills. In particular, you see this in the parent group, where the skills are the same, but there's very different delivery around making sure that you have a relationship before you do any punitive stuff, those kinds of things. So that changed in about 2008. And then we also had the SNAP for Schools model. So that was a targeted, universal model where we would actually go into the schools and deliver it to actual classrooms. Didn't matter if the kids were of the top 2% for those groups. We could just go in, deliver it, getting kids. Because when we noticed that we had SNAP for Schools in a community and in a clinical program, they tended to rob each other of numbers, right? So they were kind of fighting for numbers. And the other thing too is if parents don't have to be involved, chances are they're not going to be involved. And so if we could do it in the school and target a kid, that's great because the parent doesn't have to be involved. But when they go home, the changes haven't happened. Right? And then YJ is not on there, so that program that I was talking about is not on there, but that is part of it as well. So that was in about 2013, I think they started to make those changes and take a look at that. So I talked a little bit about this already, but why the need for a gender-sensitive program? When we looked at the imbalance, it was tended to be about 1 to 4 in terms of referral numbers. So when you're putting the kids in the group, we would always put 2 girls in the group, but it was very different. What does the boy think? What do they tend to think? I'm going to punch him. I'm going to knock him out, right? That's that person. The ball gets taken from the girl. What does the girl tend to think on average? They don't like me. That's why they're doing it. They don't like me, right? There's something wrong with me. I can't do this. That's why they're taking it off of me, right? So being able to focus on that and being able to address that thinking and not saying that isn't happening for boys either, because it is happening for boys. And the more that we're learning about these kids, they realize that we have to focus on changing our thoughts around our behavior and the things that are happening to us. So that was there too, as well as the risk. There was an increased risk of anxiety and depression that was occurring in some of these girls as well. Again, not to say that that's not happening in boys. So here's a little bit of information on the two programs. One thing that I am going to draw your attention to is the fact that on the left side, you see the SNAP Boys. So we are the most fully developed intervention for children experiencing disruptive behavior problems to date in Canada. Full funding was received in 1985. So we had all these collaborations happening. What do you notice in the girls? So it is the only, we'll cover that part, is that it's the only program for disruptive behavior problems for girls. What do you notice about the funding? Right. Interesting there. Right? How that ended up happening. Interestingly enough, CDI is still not fully funded for the girls model. Other models are. So those 7 sites that I was talking about, they are fully funded. The site that I came from, we were fully funded. But CDI itself still fundraises to support the girls program. Interesting. We're going to talk about money, right? In terms of effect sizes, so Bonnie, you'd like this as well. So the 0.8 to 1.2 effect size for the boys. So that's actually a very large change in terms of their behavior. So that when we're talking about rule-breaking behavior, aggressive behavior, those changes were actually quite sizable. And we saw very similar, not as high results, but moderate results with the girls as well. So we are able to prove that it is working for these girls. And it is not just due to change of age and all those kinds of things. So some of the differences that you'll see, I already talked a little bit about this, but just changes in the manual in terms of the structure. Girls tend to be able to sit for a little bit longer, so the activities tend to not be as high energy. When you have a group of younger girls, you may disagree with me, absolutely, because those are some of our tougher groups. They are rangy, they are very high energy, so having to do like body breaks, that kind of stuff, which are all great for the girls. You're going to notice that a lot of the information is really guided towards like focus on social isolation, body image, those kinds of things, being able to focus on those. Less emphasis on stealing and fair play. Not to say that that's not happening, but we can address that individually with these girls. So those are, when we look at the 13-week sessions, they're the 13 big sessions that we would have to deliver. The other ones can be delivered as well. Likewise with the boys, right? We can do the whole thing with the social piece with the boys as well. Another big piece is the same-sex modeling. So female staff only for the girls programming. And that's, so a lot of, I'm getting some faces there. So with the boys, we did notice that they benefited greatly from a male and female in group. And the reason why is because the boys were able to actually see a male and female talking to each other on the same level. So that was modeled for them. With the girls, we took a look at the trauma history there, and a lot of the girls that were coming through did have some experience with trauma. The parents did have some experience with trauma, and so the female staff was more out of safety. It was following the literature at the time and taking a look at what people were saying were the best practices. It was a caveat, but it's something that we have absorbed and we have said, that's the best possible way to do this to make sure that we're limiting risk. Here's just a list of some of the things that describe SNAP. So it is community-based. We do take a look at the child's ecosystem. So how do we get everybody involved in helping this child? It's theoretically grounded, so we're going to cover a lot of that in the second week when we talk about the parenting stuff. You'll see a lot of the evidence of the theories that have informed SNAP. It is cognitive behavioral. So you're going to see a lot of that. I mean, it's very evident. You're going to see it with the boys. You're going to see it with the girls. It's cognitive behavioral throughout. Gender sensitive, multifaceted. It's not just about groups. It's about individual work too. It's also about going to where the family is. And I know this is something that's different for a lot of communities. I know when I was just doing a training in Hamilton, we had the conversation around actually going into the homes. And that becomes tough. Right? Because people don't necessarily feel safe, but that's a really important part of the program, is actually going into the home and going to where the struggles are actually happening and supporting them there. Because if they get that, then they tend to see how things work a little bit easier when they're in the home. It is manualized, so the manuals do cover how do we facilitate groups. That's when we talk about like, a little bit more of the fidelity stuff, being able to track how we're doing, what things we're covering. We're going to talk a little bit about that in the afternoon. You're going to be able to do a fidelity checklist on Des and I just to make sure we're doing a good job with the group. We do a risk needs assessment. That's called the EARL. So we'd be able to take a look at, again, prioritization of risk, right? So what things are we going to cover first? Who are we going to prioritize? How are we going to dose out sessions for these people so they actually get what they need? And then we actually tailor the intervention. So we take a look at the person. We don't make that person fit the intervention. We fit the intervention to the person, whatever makes sense for them. And we have a centralized services protocol for the kids who tend to be getting into these troubles. So at the beginning, I think this is the next slide actually. Oh, no. So at the beginning, we noticed a lot of like police-based referral, but now we're looking at schools. Schools that are being able to identify, okay, we're having some struggle with behavior here, here, and here, and we're able to respond to that. So being able to inform your community as to what's going on and what SNAP is all about, that goes right down to the teachers, down to the principals, those kinds of things. That way they can get the kids to us and we're not missing any kids that are falling through the cracks. When we look at the boys and girls that come into our program, and this really just furthers the whole thing about childhood aggression, predicting problems in boys and in girls being the same kind of thing. When you take a look at those lists, are there that many differences on those lists? Not really, right? Maybe a little bit with the social isolation, body image, social aggression. So essentially what we had is we had an agreement with the police. In Hamilton, we still have it. It's called the centralized, Toronto has it too, but it's not as prevalent anymore. It's called the centralized services, ready for this one? Centralized services protocol for children under 12 in conflict with the law. Believe it or not, I had to answer the phone like that every single time somebody called. It just drove me nuts, right? So what we do is we would meet with them and we would make sure that the officers that were actually going out and responding to calls were aware of what this was. So if they were under the age of 12, they could speak to the parent. We're going to talk about that in a little bit, but it's good that it came up now because I can skip over that in a little bit. So what they would do is they would tell the parent, they would get the parent's permission, give us the information, and we would call the parent within 24 to 48 hours and start to book some of the intake screening stuff, be able to get some background information so we can help them the best. So that's how it would work. At the beginning, that was really like the bread and butter of the program. That's how we got referrals, but now it tends to be more in the schools that are being able to identify. People's eyes are a little bit more open in terms of disruptive behavior. So they're able to take a look at that and say, these are people we want to be able to identify to support them the best. Because really, when you're looking at police referring, we realize that that's one group of people that would further down the road. But with the teachers, it's kind of nice because when the teachers and the principals are able to refer, we're able to get a whole broad range. So we have actually changed our mission statement to keep kids in school and out of trouble, as opposed to prevent kids from getting in trouble with the law. So we want to broaden that because it really has impact later on. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if they're going to get in trouble with the law. We want to help somebody regardless because it still impacts them as a person. It still impacts social spending. Try getting the government to understand that one too, right? It can be hard at some points in time because when we start to realize that impacts social spending, because they're accessing healthcare later, they're accessing things that require community spending, it does have an impact, right? Here's the question of the day. So if we were taking a look at this list, what do you think when we're looking at the parents when they come through the door? So this is kind of like a snapshot. If you were to take a look at a child that was coming through our door, a snapshot of them in words, what describes them? What do you think would be that same snapshot? What do you think would find its way over to the parents? What do the parents look like? I heard it. Somebody said it, they whispered it. Exactly. So when you're looking at that, poor emotional regulation skills are right there, top of the list. The reason why is because it's being modeled. Handling difficult emotions is being modeled for them. And so we need to be able to look at how do we do that for parents too, right? How do we get them to be able to challenge these emotions that are happening for them? Some of the things that we're seeing are obviously like the punitive laissez-faire discipline style, flipping, flopping in terms of parenting style. So, you're going to get grounded for one thing for an entire month, and then the next time you do it, I'm not even going to pay attention to it. Those kinds of things that you're like, okay, interesting. Poor monitoring, supervision. So a lot of things that we saw in Toronto were very similar in Hamilton where, I had kids that are on caseload, 6, 7-year-olds that were out till 1 in the morning, right? And you're thinking like, This is a young kid. It's a dangerous community. No, right? So a lot of these kids were exposed to risks they really shouldn't have been exposed to, hanging out with friends at parks with 14, 15-year-old kids. They're 9 years old. So different levels of risk that we saw. And one of the big things that we do see is strained parent-child relationship. We hear a lot of things like, and you've probably heard this 100 times, I love my child, but I do not like my child. Right? So we hear that a lot. Some of the things that just don't help, so all the distal factors there, the lack of supports, so the isolation that seems to be occurring for them, a lot of oppression. So one of the things that we notice is that especially for new Canadians, they really struggle because they feel like the communities aren't necessarily open to them. And it's true. It's true. When you take a look at some of the barriers that occur for people that are first coming to Canada, it's profound, right? You can't ignore it. High-risk communities, high list of stressors, whether that's health problems or employment problems, whatever it is. Antisocial conduct coming from them as well. And then the poverty and substance abuse with factors itself in there as well. So in terms of short-term and long-term outcomes, and this is not after SNAP programming, this is if they don't get intervention for boys and girls. Yeah, exactly. Awful sales job. We're noticing school dropout, unemployment, obviously affiliation with not the best peers. So violent acts, so committing violent crimes, juvenile delinquency, and adult antisocial disorders. So things that they don't get the intervention that they need, and then it kind of brings itself into a full-blown antisocial disorder as an adult. With girls themselves, what we notice is early sexualized behaviors, early dating, problematic relationships, teen pregnancy, offspring with the same sort of behavioral difficulties. Health problems, depression, and unemployment are really big on the list there. So we already covered this, but this is a referral procedure, so that's really what happens. So again, police take the referral, have the parents' permission, call us, we call them with 24, 48 hours, and we do an intake with them, right? We don't want to make them wait because chances are they won't necessarily follow through. So this is the implementation plan. So this is really what we're looking for now. And this should be near and dear to you guys because this is essentially what you guys are going to be living. How do you implement this in a community way? So when we're looking at the affiliate site, so the affiliate site really here is the community, right? With specific members that are being identified as the people who are going to be delivering the program. We're going to try and get some school board involvement, right, so that we get the kids filtering out your way. So you'll have an entire team of people that are able to recognize that this is the program that responds to disruptive behavior for kids under 12 in conflict with the law, or kids under 12 just having some behavior difficulties at school as well. And then you're always connected, like Des said, you're not going to get rid of us. So you're always connected to us at the SNAP headquarters. So that whole wraparound type community intervention. We're not going to go too much into this here, and we're going to go into that in the final day here. When we're looking at risk factors, we'll just get a couple. What are some risk factors do you think you'd want to be able to identify in some of the kids that were having trouble? What things would you see in these kids?
Try to contain yourself.
Yes. The barrage of questions. Yep. So aggressive behaviors. Yeah. Antisocial behavior. Yeah. Yep. So the parenting maybe is missing a little bit. One last one and we'll move on. I'll show you the whole list of the ones that we've. Sorry? Yep. So household circumstances around finances and things like that. Absolutely. So these are the EARLs, and that's when we're talking about the risk needs assessment. That's exactly what we're doing here. So we're going to go a little bit more into that on the final day there. So those are all of them up there. There's a couple that are gender specific, so you can see them there. So things that we're covering, you guys nailed a couple of them: household circumstances, antisocial behavior, the parenting style, also peers, what peers they're associating with, whether or not adults like them, That's another one, right? Another big one. The responsivity, those kinds of things that we're looking at. But we're also looking at gender-specific ones that are just in the boys and girls. So for the girls, you're seeing caregiver-daughter interaction as one of them. And that's a specific item. You're going to see that interaction piece with the boys as well, but it covers both nurturing and the instrumental stuff, the boundaries and stuff. With that, with the girls, it's just covering the nurturing piece, the relationship they actually have. You can see sexual development with the girls. And with the boys, we're going to see authority contact. So we use this tool to be able to measure risk and dose out sessions. And that's what it looks like. So it's a one-page summary, essentially. So if you were to pick up this page, you'd be able to take a look and say, I have a reasonable understanding as to what this family is facing right now. So it's kind of nice that way. And that's the coding sheet. Again, to be continued at the end of the 9 days. So some of the research, we want to be able to make a difference in the lives of the kids. So we want to be able to actually do something. We want to be able to apply the actual supported methods, the evidence-based methods. And we want to be able to say, are we doing the best possible job that we can do? When we look at change, even small reductions in disruptive behaviors have an impact later on, both in the lives of the people that we're working with, but also in terms of social spending. If we can reduce behaviors, maybe it's not that we keep somebody out of the youth justice system, but maybe it's that we reduce the behaviors, the reasons why they're going. That has a huge impact later on. It still has a large impact later on in terms of economics, in terms of actual family life and health. And the importance around treatment outcome research is we want to be able to improve our actual practice. Are we doing the best thing? What can we do better? We're advancing the field, and we're hoping to advance the field by the information that we're gathering. We're hoping to be accountable, so we're doing what we're saying we're going to do. Improve what's actually working. We want to make sure that we're not doing any more harm. Right? We can make efforts and create unintentional harm, and we don't want to do that. Cost effectiveness is a big one, because if you're not cost effective, the government's not going to look at you. So some of the studies that have been done. Again, not going to go into these with too much depth. If you have one of these, it does summarize some of the information for you. And just so that you're aware is that when we're looking at this, we do use multiple sources of information. We're not just pulling it from one source. We want to make sure that this is actual real change. So we use multiple sources of information to track outcome for these kids. So some of the key findings with boys, we saw significant improvements after treatment and maintaining gains at 6 and 12 months. Right, so that's a really big one with the girls. Significant changes pre and post follow-up in terms of the differences in aggression and social relations, sorry. We talked about the red flags, we talked about the effect sizes a little bit earlier. The red flags that we did see with the highest risk factor girls were admission depression, conduct disorder, and sexual development was a really big one as well. We'll get a little bit more into that in a little bit. And we were able to do some replication site studies to be able to see, could we do this outside of Toronto? And the fact that I came from Hamilton is a good indication that we could. Or did you have, no? This is a third-party evaluation. This is pretty cool. So this is actually from Pittsburgh. The end value here is 85 for SNAP services, and then standard services being 84. So we try to compare out how do the kids in standard services do in comparison to the kids in SNAP services. So those blue lines, so blue and blue dotted, are measurement of the standard services, and the red was actually SNAP. So the severe cases are the dotted lines, and the standard cases were really the solid lines. So what we took a look at is the actual improvement. So when you're looking at like aggressive behavior, rule breaking conduct, and even total externalizing difficulties, you saw that there was actually a larger improvement when they were given SNAP services as opposed to the standard service. There was a lot that was involved in the differences here. Some other really interesting information here is emotional regulation skills, standard service being gray and SNAP service being black. You saw here that the kids who were coming into programming actually, they did better in terms of their improvements around social or emotional regulation skills, and they did better around pro-social communication as well. Right? So there was something that was working here that was helping them to get better. Really interesting, the next slide, right? So in comparison to standard services, which again is in gray, and SNAP, which is in black, what you're seeing there is you're seeing standard services for expectations of remorse for antisocial behavior. That was actually going down. That was actually going down. So their expectations of feeling bad for the things that they were actually doing, that was going down with standard services. And what they noticed with the regular SNAP service, that it actually maintained, it essentially maintained, gained a little bit here over time at time 4. We were able to measure a little bit of a gain. Expectations of punishment or consequence to their actual behavior. Again, with the standard services, it went down. With SNAP, it went up. It went up sizably this time. So kids understood that when you were able to think about the consequences of your actions, you were able to come up with a better understanding as to what was going to happen to you. You're going to make this choice. There are consequences that happen. In terms of progress towards goals, when we took a look at how did they do, so after the groups, we'd take a look at CSQ, so Client Satisfaction Questionnaire. So here we have the goals. How well do you think you did on your goal? We have the majority falling into the great, some falling into the so-so, and not many falling into the not great. So we're looking at doing some pretty good change there, right? With the girls, same thing. Apparently in 2014, the stars aligned properly, and 100% of the girls achieved their... Yep, all great. Well, and then in terms of how much did you learn about self-control, you're seeing the majority falling into the a whole lot and pretty much categories. The a little and not much actually helps us to inform. It helps to inform us as what can we do to change that too, because we'll know some of the cases that are involved there, and we can say, okay, maybe there's a better way of delivering it to this group of people. So that helps us to do that. But for the most part, we see that they learn a lot. And these are the kids answering this as well. So this kind of speaks to the need, like we were talking about doing something beyond the 13 weeks. So it's not just about the 13 weeks. So here we have 3 lines here. So the standard is just the 13-week program. So what happens to these kids that just get the 13-week program? And then what happens to the kids that get the 13-week plus some? So what we notice is they all start out at an average point of 72.7, so just above the clinical border there. With the standard services, you notice that they do drop below that line, the 70 line, but they stay at 69.2 on average. So they get better, but they tend to stay the same, right, at that point. They get a little bit better, but they stay there. What we notice is that with the extended services, the enhanced model, they actually do quite a bit better over time. So they're learning the skills, they're applying it properly, and even at specific points when they're getting extra stuff other than the 13-week program, they're doing better. So we can be doing individual work with them depending on the case at any point in time, but you're seeing that these kids are actually doing quite a bit better there. And then the green line is the aggregate. So those two together, what's the overall outcome there? In terms of like the family outcomes, mothers and fathers report that they feel like they're becoming better parents, right? They broaden the repertoire of the parenting skills that they had. They're reporting a lot less stress in their actual role as a parent. They feel like they can stick to things. They can remain consistent with things. The families become closer, so more positive times with the kids, less yelling, less of the instrumental having to hold down rules, those kinds of things. Less yelling, more talking, and then siblings getting along a lot better. So those are the things that we're seeing there. And all of it leads to the parent feeling quite a bit more confident. And that's really the goal here. That's the difference. Right? So the parent feels like they're in control. Because a lot of the times the things that we're looking at, and when we're talking to the parents right off the bat, one of the things that they will often say to you is things are out of control. Right? So if we can get them feeling like they're in the driver's seat again, a lot better. one of the big things that and this is not the active ingredient, but this is one of the things that they like about it. So this is the reasons for change and why they liked coming to group. When you see that, one of the biggest answers was peer support. The fact that they weren't in that alone. They realized that there's a whole group of people around them that are facing similar difficulties. And it's not saying that the parents, like you could put anybody in this group and it would work. The active ingredient is actually the skill base that we're teaching, but the thing that helps them along the way is that peer support, knowing that you are not by yourself doing this. What we did was we partnered with Sick Kids in Toronto, and we wanted to measure brain activity and how kids actually process difficult situations. So what we did was we put this, and there's no picture of it on here, it's a huge EEG machine that goes around them, and it's got like a whole bunch of points to measure which area of the brain was processing specific situations that were happening. So what we did was we gave them a video game it started off really easy. The more points they got, the better prize they got. As they continued on, the game got harder. It took points away. They encountered frustration. And then what ends up happening is they end up at the beginning with not many points. So they end up getting a consolation prize of like a pencil. And they have to encounter that frustration and see what actually happens. So at the beginning, we measured it at the beginning before SNAP and at the end to see if there was actually a difference in the way that the brain processed this difficult situation and see what happened, right? So here's what we noticed. At the beginning, that front part of the brain, the ventral region, was really active. So that's the fight or flight. That's like, I'm going to punch the video game because it's not giving me the points. That's that part of the brain that was really active, and you could see it there. In the second part, you can see that area not as live. So it was there, but it wasn't as live. But there's a different area of the brain that we're looking at now that started to take over. So this was actually in 13 weeks. That's the cool part about this. So in 13 weeks, their brains were actually rewiring, right? They were able to start to look at things a little bit differently. And so this other area of the brain, the dorsal region, this is the higher thinking area of the brain. This is the area that talks about like priorities, like how do I prioritize this? It's executive functioning. What things do I need to do first? How do I think about consequences based on this choice? That's all there. And it's starting to increase in the second part here, where it was almost asleep, hibernating at some point in time. After 13 weeks, you're starting to see that as a lot more active. And obviously it had its benefits, so there was a whole bunch of stuff that was going on there. Again, not going to go into that with too much depth. But the really cool part about that is just realizing that when you have an evidence-based program and you're facilitating the evidence-based program, you actually have an impact on a person's brain, the way that their brain functions, which is hugely, it's hugely empowering to know that. But at the same time, it's good to know that their brains can rewire themselves.